Hello, welcome to the Performing Animal Rights series, where I talk to activists and creatives about their work in the animal rights movement. My name is Ben Hunt. I am a performance artist and researcher at De Montfort University. I'm currently doing a PhD in performing arts in animal rights. And we've got a really exciting and interesting episode coming up with Harley McDonald-Eckersall, where we talk all things performing arts in the disruptive element of the animal rights movement, civil disobedience, direct action. Harley is currently part of the narrative and strategy team for Animal Rebellion, which is a sister group of Extinction Rebellion who are protesting and disrupting to get their demands of climate justice and animal justice, pointing to the huge impact animal agriculture, particularly factory farming, has on carbon emissions, deforestation, methane emissions, and all sorts of nasty stuff that's contributing to climate degradation and the climate crisis. They're quite a new group, a few years old, born from a coalition of a lot of different animal rights movements as well Extinction Rebellion. And Harley's bang in the middle of the UK branch of that organisation, Animal Rebellion. Now, Harley is a social change organiser specialising in areas of strategic communications and movement strategy. At 2016, at the age of 19, Harley became involved with the animal justice movement, co-founding the organisation Young Voices for Animals shortly after making a personal transition to veganism, while studying theatre and performance at Monash University. In January 2020, she moved to the UK to join Animal Rebellion. So Harley seeks to use her background in art and theatre to contribute to the development of a powerful movement for animals, which draws and learns from the dynamic potential and creative potential of performance. And that's what we delve into today, covering what it means to be creative in the movement and what space there is for performance, performing arts, theatre, and creativity in the movement, where it can really help and where it already manifests. So I hope you really enjoy this episode. I hope you find as much value in it as I did. And if you did, and if you do, please do leave a review, share, support in any way you see fit and can. And all that's left to say is on with the episode. Thanks, Harley, for joining me. So I'd just like to pick your brains about your experience and your thoughts as well about performing arts specifically and animal rights, but also going down different avenues around creativity and activism together and separately as well. So the first question is, what originally compelled you to perform in animal rights? It doesn't have to be specific performance, it could just be your activism and your participation in animal rights, and where do you see yourself in that sphere?
Yeah, so I guess for me there's always been a convergence. So I guess I was involved with performing in theatre before I was involved with animal rights. So like my mum's an artist, so I grew up around art, and like art is an expression of social and political issues, and also just art as an expression of like an inner world. So that was kind of how I was raised, and then that led me to start doing like performance and like amateur theatre, and then that led me to decide to study theatre at university, and studying theatre not as like learning how to act or be a performer, but more understanding theatre as like a way of expression. And I guess like convergence comes from was while I was studying theatre and like learning all these things about how throughout time art and performance have been used to communicate and to debate and to think about these big issues, like from when it was used as like in Greek theatre as a way of like being part of democracy in ancient like ways of discourse, and throughout time, and like performance art and how that's also been like this key part of like sharing and communicating about political issues. So while I was learning about that, that was when I got involved in animal rights, and I became vegan for like philosophical animal ethics, like animal sentience and anti-speciesism reasons. And I guess like the two worlds collided very early on for me, in that I was studying theatre and learning about theatre, and I was at the same time becoming vegan, becoming passionate and wanting to learn more and do more about like anti-speciesism. So I guess it just always seemed very natural to me that art and performance is a way of moving forward political movements, and that when it comes to animal rights, there's no way of like divorcing the two. And yeah, so I guess like that for me was my big motivator of just like the way the two kind of came up into my life like at the same time, but then also realizing like the power that performance has to share stories that are hard to communicate, or share things that are difficult to grasp, through other mediums. And I think like when I was getting more involved in animal rights and like grappling with this problem that I think anyone who tries to advocate for animals who aren't human grapples with, of that we are an ally movement. There's these whole group of people who are the ones who are oppressed, who can't take the stage and speak in English and speak in human languages to share their oppression. So we have to find new ways of communicating. This is why we need a new kind of world. This is why we need an animal rights movement. So I guess those things all kind of combined of like the power that performance has to share stories other than human. And yeah, just like the fact that I think without performance, without art, I don't think that a lot of stories could have been shared at times when they weren't like socially acceptable. So I guess that's what inspires me or motivated me to think about the two together, of just seeing performances being entwined with so many social struggles.
Yeah, that sounds like a very similar story to me. My connection came a bit later on, for sure, because I'd studied theatre, and then I became an activist after that, and then it started to intertwine, but it took me a while. But I totally get that. I really like the idea that you reference like the whole Greek theatre thing, and it's thinking politically is the same as thinking theatrically, and I think that's fascinating. So what do you think the other activists around you maybe, and people other colleagues and things, when you think like this, is there a shared thinking, is there a shared appreciation, or is there some persuasion on your end, or is this a kind of, it's your own thing that you carry with you in your activism, and then if people want to engage, where does the idea of performance and activism for you reach out to other activists, if it does?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. And I think like what I've noticed is that people, I guess I almost see activism as sometimes being a bit of like a blank slate, and people bring with them their views of the world into that. So like I see people who come into activism and see it as very like, it's like, we're trying to sell something to someone. It's like a sales pitch, and they're bringing in this kind of like more like, yeah, I guess like that realm of thinking. Or it's like, you kind of get involved in groups that are very like run like kind of like a corporate enterprise with like KPIs and all that. And like, so I think like there's so many different ways to do activism, people bringing in like their experience of the world. So I guess like I do see to an extent that because I have that background and I have that mindset of thinking like a performer and thinking about theatre, that's what I bring in. But I think in my experience, people see the value of theatricality. So they see the value of, creating, for example, like actions that are performative and that, are, I guess, like theatre in some ways. So yeah, I guess like people seem to instinctively or intuitively respond to that, or be drawn to that, of doing things that share a message through more than just like words. So I think there's a big, like, in the circles that I'm in, we're creating like these actions. There's a big push towards like, making actions that can be understood through a single image, which I think is very, performance based, and it's very theatrical. And I think that kind of like outward facing actions, I guess, yeah, those are, I think, very people are very kind of drawn to theatre and performance in those kind of spaces. But what I think is maybe more something that I hold within me, is the words you use, I guess, like, is that more sense of like bringing a theatrical lens to activism as a whole, and bringing a theatrical lens to how we organize and how we create, like, build movements, and that more like internal work. And I think that's something that maybe it's still something I'm grappling with, and I'm trying to understand. Like, for example, like I studied like the cultural and creative industries and like cultural economics, and I look at that and I think about the principles that allow us to understand culture and like the cultural industries, and I see those being so applicable to how we understand like social movements and movement theory. But that's, I think, something I hold a lot more in me, whereas like when we're creating these big outward facing actions that are trying to get press, it's not really a hard sell to be like, yeah, we should be bringing in elements of performance and theatricality, because everyone's like, yes, we want them to be big, bold, flashy, audacious. So yeah, I think there's those two different sides of it, maybe like the visible performance and the internal like theatricality.
If I can pick your brains about that, about the action planning. So say you're action planning with the Animal Rebellion, and there's a, like you said, there's this awareness and a kind of inevitability that there will be a performance aspect to it. What is the dynamics like in that respect of, is the action plan like, we're going to disrupt this place, then let's plug on a performance thing? Or is it wouldn't it be interesting if we disrupted it by doing this performance or this image or this kind of visual? Is there a certain process there, or is it different either each time?
Yeah, I think for the big disruptive actions we've done, so like when I say we, I'm referring to like Animal Rebellion, the group I've been working with for almost 2 years. That's definitely been more like the former. So it has been like, this is a target, and then like designing in, like theatrical elements. So for example, like with the McDonald's blockades that we did, like having the target and having the campaign, and then building things like the big burger and the big Happy Meal box and things like that to be part of that, rather than being like, oh, imagine if we had this giant burger. But I know, for instance, like there's been times when it's been like, we want an element, and then we design an action around that. So for example, the unhappy meal box that was used for one of the actions was just this big box with an unhappy face. Like that was a prop that we'd wanted to use somewhere at some point for quite a long time. So it wasn't like we had this action and then we were like, oh, what can we use to bring this? It was like that prop kind of existed by itself externally from the action. The same thing with like the clown car, like that was used in the first McDonald's blockade. Like that prop, I guess, existed, had its own world, had its own kind of like creative sphere around it. So I definitely think like that has happened. But I think also when we're thinking about actions, a big, I guess, motivator for picking targets is their creative potential, and their like, I guess, theatrical potential. So it's like, for example, why we chose, like, I think a big like motivator, like why we chose like McDonald's over anywhere else we could have done that's using animals, is because of how theatrical they are. And I know like people are really drawn to this like idea of Ronald McDonald, and like this whole theater around McDonald's is very appealing when you're thinking about like a target. So I definitely think like that's such a big element of choosing, like, out of an endless stream of options of who you can like put the spotlight on, to bring attention to, like, well, in this case, like animal agriculture and climate, but just like also animal exploitation more broadly. I think, theatre is such a big part of that, of like this like creative force that some brands or corporations like envision, of just like people already have a cultural frame of reference around it. Whereas like instead of you having to build a whole new cultural reference point around like an unknown brand or something that's not doesn't bring up associations with anyone, like I think targets that have their own theatricality, like they're so appealing because like people have that in their head already.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I never thought about that. That playing on their own theatricality, and you see that, I suppose, in my experience anyway, of say a an action at a slaughterhouse has less theatricality, outward looking theatricality than one out of McDonald's, purely because of the theatricality of the brand and of
Mm.
the audience that's looking, and the use of props is like having their own energy and how you use that. That's that's fascinating. Yeah. So, what drew you to Animal Rebellion? What was it about Animal Rebellion that, just as an activist or as a creative as well, maybe?
Yeah, I think as an activist, and I think that they're both like, yeah, so I'm fine. It's like as an activist and a creative is probably the same thing of like, I think a lot of creative people are drawn to opportunities that allow for like exploration. And I think Animal Rebellion, when I got involved, a big part about it was that it was so like unformed and new, and it was trying to do a lot of new things. So like that's about a whole bunch of things, like how it's structured, like the structure that's used, the social, like the theory that was trying to be applied. It was like trying to apply a lot of like theory. It was trying to bring in new like messaging and things like that, which is kind of like what I got involved with from the beginning of the story, and also with the actions as well, trying to find new ways of getting the media and cutting through and shifting perception and things like that. So I think it was that like raw, almost unformed nature of it that kind of drew me, in that it didn't have a prescribed, like associated, this is what this group does, and if you join this group, this is what you do. Whereas like I think there's a lot of groups within within the animal rights movement who are very associated with like one thing, like one tactic. So yeah, for example, Save, and the vigils and Meet the Victims and all that. So, and I think like, a lot of those groups do like a lot of really great work and like really transformational for a lot of people. But I guess what drew me to Animal Rebellion was this feeling of like innovation or ability to try new things and experiment. And I think that also comes out of being smaller and more unknown, which Animal Rebellion was at the time when I got involved. So yeah, I guess it's that sense of this is a place to experiment and explore. And I think like, I know as a creative, I'm always seeking that of like, where can I try new things or like apply things that are in my head onto the ground. And I think as an activist, I am as well, of wanting to be in spaces where you can like innovate and like try things and test them, and if they don't work, then go back and try new things.
As you've been involved with Animal Rebellion for so long, where have you found your evolution as a activist and performer within this sphere of Animal Rebellion? Has it changed? Is it?
Yeah, for sure. So I got involved in Animal Rebellion at quite an interesting time, because it was formed like back in like June 2019, and I got involved in like January 2020. So it was like after like the first rebellion and all that. But it was an interesting time where the people, most of the people who had initially conceptualized and started Animal Rebellion had like stepped away, and a whole bunch of very like new people had kind of come in and were trying to use the like raw material that had been left to like build something new. So it was a really interesting time, I think, of like a lot of learning from a lot of people. So I guess like as a journey in a way, like when you come in and something's being built and there's a lot of like energy around it, and there's a lot of like I guess creative energy kind of like being like spread around, because there's no path like laid out in front of you. So I think for me, like that's kind of when I came in, when everything was very buzzing with this new energy. And then like I think very early on as being involved, like we got sucked into like COVID and everything being online. And funnily enough, like for me, that was like quite a really interesting time of like being able, like a lot of connection and a lot of like conversation happened during that, even though there wasn't much like actual stuff that we could do. So there was a lot of opportunity to like think and explore and like, I guess, try things even if they weren't being able to physically try things, because you were able to like, and I know at that point, like, I was part of like an animal rebellion performers group, and we met just to talk about like projects and things that we were thinking about, even though we couldn't really do much like physically. So for me, yeah, like that was kind of like this middle point, this whole, as I think for everyone, of being inside and having ideas and wanting to be creative, but being a bit limited, which, you know, kind of like has its negatives and positives of, I think, you know, like limitations can like lead to really amazing creative kind of outputs. But I guess like now, if we're kind of like to look at like that first bit that I was talking about, which was like, yeah, there was no path, there was just a lot of creative energy and like things were moving in all different directions. I think now Animal Rebellion like has gotten to a point where it's figured out what it's good at. It's figuring out what it's good at. And that's an interesting thing, because it means that, you know, we're a lot more, we can do a lot more. And the things that we do are a lot more impactful, I think. But it also means that, you know, that original like creative energy of like things going off in all different directions and trying new things, and some of them working and some of them not working, like that's not there as much anymore, which I think like as a creative person, that's an interesting place to be. And like it's almost more exciting to be there when things are not formed and they're raw, and you know, you're just kind of going off everywhere. And like once, at least for me, once I get to that point where like, okay, this is how it is now, this is all set, it's almost like you've gone over that first like exciting bit of like, oh, this could go anywhere. But like also as an activist, you can say like, yeah, this is having more impact, this is, you know, refined. So I think like it's an interesting thing. I haven't really thought about it properly, maybe to like see the different parts of that kind of experience, or to be like, okay, now this is like a specific outlet, and this is how we use creativity or theatricality, and maybe that's more formed now and more set now. So yeah, I think it is, I guess, an evolution, and it's going to keep evolving. But it's an interesting thing to think about, of like how I almost think that groups, at least activism, like groups that I've been part of, almost like they're drawn to being confined. Like they seem to just naturally slide to doing a very set group of things. And then, yeah, I just think that's a really interesting thing, because I think the nature of like art and performance is to, I guess, try and break out of confinement and try and push boundaries and keep changing and evolving.
Where do you think Animal Rebellion's audience is now? Is it different kinds of audiences, or do you guys feel like you're focused on a certain type of audience when you're doing these actions?
Yeah, for the most part, like when we're doing actions, our goal is usually to get like press, and to get quite a lot of like mainstream press. So I think in that regard, we're definitely seeing our audience as being like the general population, which can take, you know, any form. And I think that's all, yeah, often like a big focus, and also a big reason for like using things like props and staging and stuff, which is to get media attention, and then like that allows our message to go further. But I also do think we have this like there has been this very like strong focus on like reaching out to like the environmental movement and encouraging like uptake of this message of like animal agriculture in the environmental movement. So I think like that has also been a big audience, and in that way it's almost like at the moment, between I think quite a few groups, there's like this competition to do like the most bold, audacious, showy action. And while that on one hand, that's what allows us to get press and reach a broad audience, on another hand, that's also like it's like a street cred thing in a way of like, when you're doing these actions and you're causing this disruption and you're like sending this message, it's also reaching out to other like, activist groups, being like, this is what we're doing. Like, don't you want to be involved? So I think it's like, and when I guess like that's an interesting thing when thinking about like the performance elements of the kind of dual purpose they serve of getting press by being like very outward facing and audacious, and also kind of drawing attention from within like movements and almost competing in a way, not in like a negative, like trying to like steal attention away from other movements, but more in I guess it does kind of feel like a friendly competition. And I think like Animal Rebellion has probably brought in the theatricality a lot, and has also brought it outside of rebellions. I think like XR definitely uses it in like rebellions and stuff, like the big pink boat and the various iterations of the big pink boat. But I think like more bringing it to other places and unlikely places, like to the more like industrial estates and stuff, which we've been doing a lot, is like something that I think has brought a lot of attention to us from like within the movement as well, of these people who like this group of people who are trying to change the system, but who also are using like theater as a way of expressing like, I guess, existential dread, as well as like as getting attention.
Yeah, that's super interesting thinking about activists as an audience. Have you ever felt, I'm assuming, I mean, just through my own experience, that new groups that are doing stuff and getting press also garner criticism from the movement they're part of as well? Has there been, from a creative side as well, has there ever been have you ever come across criticism around the way things are presented, maybe? Or there's arguments in the animal rights movement of how we perform, how we get a message across about the non-human animal without, how do we testify of the non-human animal without causing offense about the non-human animals? So whether that's sexualizing them in a way, or making light of their plight. I mean, I don't know whether, I'm a big fan of comedy, so I do find value in that, but there's obviously some lines that are drawn by certain activist groups. Have you ever felt the brunt of that?
Yeah, for sure. So I know like early on, so this was before I was involved as well, like even just around like, I think one of the first big things that like Animal Rebellion got a lot of press for was like the veggie dance party and like Mr. Broccoli. And like that was, I think, like a big early use of like performance in Animal Rebellion. And the whole kind of like Mr. Broccoli being interviewed by Piers Morgan, and that was such a big like creative theatrical stunt. And I know that got a lot of backlash within the movement of, like exactly what you're saying, like making light. And I know there's also been times like there was when we were leading up to like the first occupation of Arla, like Animal Rebellion was like using like cow costumes to try and like represent animals, and like that got a lot of backlash. And like because of that, like we haven't used representations of animals in that way again, because of like like the criticisms of that, of being speciesist and things like that. But I think it does raise these questions, like you're saying, of it is that tricky thing of how do you represent these groups. And I do feel like sometimes like animals are being lost in our actions because of a lack of ways of representing them. And I think like one way that we have tended to represent like the missing animals is, look, we have this big like X animal transports truck, which we've painted pink and like blocked roads with. We've painted red and had it McDonald's actions. We've painted white and had it the Arla actions. It's made the rounds, and I think like that has been an attempt to represent the missing animals. But I think it's a deeper question of, well, from what I've seen in like animal rights and animal liberation circles, the way we represent animals has only really been grappled with effectively in like academic literature. and it becomes quite, you can get to a point, I think, when you're writing academically, where you can represent the non-human, like other, in a way that is respectful and in a way that is not othering. But my question always is, how do we translate that into visuals? How do we translate that into something that doesn't need pages upon pages of explanation? What is that single image, or what is that like creative idea that allows us to represent those that are like exploited, those who are like the base of this movement? So yeah, I think like the short answer is definitely, like we have gotten backlash for this, and I think that has also led us down different paths. And it was, I think, part of that, like what I was mentioning, of that early like creative like force of trying new things and all that, and like that's kind of shaped what Animal Rebellion does now and like who we've become. And I do find it interesting as well, like it's made us, I think, more avoidant of representing animals, but then that comes with its positives for sure, but also the negatives of then that question of like, where are they and how do they be represented in especially like more theatrical spaces?
Yeah, it is. I think that is such a struggle, that isn't it, of representing an absent the absent animal, which is such a challenge. And also this kind of our movement, as most anti-oppressive movements are, of they're so it's such a negative experience for these groups. Like it's trauma, it's horror, it's violence, it's death. And how do we bring an exciting, eye-capturing action that gets the press without dwelling on the negatives? And because if we do that, we end up being those preachy vegans that just are always upset, and it's turning that anger into some sort of action, I suppose, isn't it? But it is difficult. So just to get a bit more granular and a bit more into your own experience, what feelings manifest when you perform your activism? So can you talk me through your experience of, because I've seen you do speeches and do performances and and do videos and stuff as like a news reporter, someone being interviewed as a news reporter. What do you feel as a performer there? Is there a certain physical feeling you have, or processing things mentally as a performer when you go into that space as a performer?
Yeah, really interesting. I think, for example, like speeches, I think it's been a long time since I've written a speech. They're usually like more spur of the moment. So I think there's definitely a lot of feelings there of like passion and frustration is a big one, of like that feeling of not being able to communicate and needing to find words, and also like wanting to, I think like it often like it comes out of a desire to connect, and a desire to connect with other people, and I guess like maybe like get other people to you want other people to be on the emotional level that you're on at that moment. I think like that's like, for me at least, like like performing in general, like that's such a big thing. Like you're always trying to reach out to an audience and bring them to the place that you're at right there. So I think, there's usually in me, there's like this sense of frustration fuels me a lot, but also like just hope that, I'm trying to find the right word, because it's definitely does come from hope. Like I think I am quite a hopeful person. I do believe that things can change, and I think like maybe like that sense of like that performance sense of me when I'm trying to do speeches, like comes from this disconnect or between hope and reality of what needs to happen and what is actually happening in that moment. So the moment I think you're specifically is I did a speech at the front of like DEFRA in the rebellion last year, and that very much came from like this disconnect between what that day was intended to be, which was like bringing people together, this really positive experience, and like this really like heavy-handed policing being done of like not letting us gather, not letting us kind of like be there, and also kind of experiencing that like grief of having just like 2 days earlier been at an action at a slaughterhouse, and just like seeing what needs to change and knowing like, yeah, I guess having a hope that there is something that could be done, and then feeling that like disconnection between like what's been happening and like what's happening right then. And then I think like in other forms as well, like doing the more like staged, I guess, performances. Yeah, it's a strange one. Like usually that's more like light. I guess I feel like a lot more lighthearted about it. Like it's, there's always a sense of like embarrassment, just like, I don't know what I'm doing. But there's also, I guess, like just this sense like if this makes one person laugh, then that's fine, because like it is more lighthearted. And I think like there's been, yeah, like things I've done for Animal Rebellion, and other groups as well, where it's just like it's I guess trying to communicate a message, and it's more like using very, very obvious theater or performance to do that. And that for me is usually a lot less emotion based. It's usually a lot more just like, okay, this is something I'm doing. It's something I'm doing right now, and it's fine. And it's, might connect with one or two people. It might kind of like, but it's also just something to kind of like communicate this message. And it's something that's part of this action that someone has planned. And I'm happy to be part of this action that someone has planned. So I think there's the more, at least for me, like when it comes to performance, the more staged something is, the less connected to my emotions it is. Whereas like when something's more spontaneous and rises out of that disconnect, like that's probably when I feel a lot more, and it's a lot more kind of like emotion based. And yeah, like I mentioned like that big desire to connect. Like you really want to connect. You want to see that someone else is then feeling what you're feeling and is able to like come along with you.
I really like the idea of this duality of kind of frustration and hope, this kind of grappling with that to push you forward into communicating. And also I completely relate to this, the embarrassment, but the need to do it because who else is going to do it? My closing question is, you've really thoughtfully touched upon that at the beginning really and throughout, but what role does performing arts have in the animal rights movement? So I suppose the probing question of that is there more that performing arts could be doing, or is it a case of should it be integral in the movement, or should it be develop as itself and then be a complement? Just these different thoughts that I've been having. Where do you think performing arts should lie, and what job should it be doing?
For sure. I think there's so many different elements to it, which isn't very helpful. Like I think any movement needs artists, in so many different forms. Like I think for one part, yeah, like performance communicates ideas. Like, so if you have elements of performance in what you're doing, it makes you more likely to be able to communicate. So that's in so many different ways. Like if you're doing like actions and you're trying to get like public attention, if you have theatrical elements, you're more likely to get public attention. Like that's just kind of like A equals B kind of thing. The more theatrical you are, the more, I think, like I always like refer to it as like the I can't believe they did that kind of effect of like when you're doing an action, like the more people will look at it and go, I can't believe they did that, the more likely you are to get press attention. Like I think a great like example of that is one of the most press we have gotten for like an action in like quite a while is like the one at Buckingham Palace during this rebellion. All we did was like, dye the fountains red, and that actually got like more press attention than this 15-minute action than when we blocked the burger factory at McDonald's for 3 days. Go figure. But I think like it's that effect of I can't believe they did that. So I think like theatricality has such an important role to play in making what we do as like externally, like what we do that's aiming to be externally facing, want to be seen. And like it's like that stickiness of if if you do something that is designed to be seen, then people are going to want to see it. Whereas if you just do something that's designed to be like experienced internally, then you kind of like questioning, well, why didn't we get press? Why didn't we get attention? Like, I think that's a big thing. So I think like that's definitely a big part of it. I think also there's like two other things that I would touch on. One is that I think there's a space or a place for creative and performing thinking and this is what we've like already talked about. I think there's a space for that to come into movement building and how we think about developing this movement for animals. And I think this like kind of like comes out as like how we understand performance, because like everything, so much of what we do is a performance. And the way when we're thinking about like, you know, performing new ways of relating to animals, like that's a way of like thinking about performance, and thinking about performing, like the ways that we want to, the world that we want to see doesn't exist. It needs to be performed. It needs to be performed until it's naturalized, and then it's in existence. And I think that's something that I see as being missing from when we're thinking about movements. It's that vision. And I think what performance does is it presents a vision, and it presents a new way of being and a new way of existing. And I think that could be incorporated into how we build movements and how we build groups and how we write about and how we think about animal rights as well. And I think the final thing is, like, when I look through art history at like social movements, there's always like this, most of the time there's a strong like accompanying art movement. And that's how like a big way that new ideas, I was going to say infiltrate, and I can't think of a better word now. So it's a big way that new ideas infiltrate into society, not through just, you know, the campaign groups and the lobby groups and all that. It's through the arts, and it's through, you know, artists making creative work that brings in new ideas or shows these different ways of living and embodying. And I think that's really powerful. And I think like that's the bit that exists alongside but outside the movement as well, because it's like, you know, it's one thing for an animal rights group to make a documentary or make a short film about animal rights. It's another thing for like a mainstream TV show or a theater performance to touch on that or bring in those elements. Like that's a incredibly powerful way of shaping and changing public discourse. And I think that's like just as needed. And I think I guess I've seen a lack there. Like I think it's something that we see it, I think, a lot stronger now in other movements, which is like a sign of like those movements like growing and gaining force. Of like now when we look at theatre and performance around other social issues, they're really kind of like working their way in. And I think like I can see that space as being a space where like animal rights can also like grow and flourish. So I guess there's three different ways.
Yeah, it's complex, isn't it? I remember starting to think about it, and I was like, oh, it'd be nice to put performance in actions, and I was like, well, hang on a minute, there's so much more performance can give in its subtle ways. Yeah, that's really, really interesting. Thank you, Harley. Is there anything I've missed, or is there anything you'd like to add before we finish up?
No, this was really good, and it's gotten my brain working as well. So thank you, because I'm just going to go away and be very excited and thinking. But yeah, I think there's so much performance already in activism, and I think it's often unrecognized, or it's just like existing, it's nascent. So I think to kind of like enliven that and recognize that and think about that and shape that as well was really exciting. And yeah, thanks for the chat.
Thank you, Harley, and thank you, the listener, for listening to this episode. If you found value in this episode, please leave a review, and if you think you know anyone who would find value in this episode, please do share it, and please join us next time for another episode. In the meantime, take care and goodbye.